up now because this is such a vital event at a critical time. I've just come back from a few days doing some work in Milan, Italy, which is a beautiful city. I saw several visibly disabled people. Significantly, most of them are begging. There are a lot of beggars in Milan. They are either from black and minority ethnic communities, or they were disabled people, the one I saw. I was able to have a little chat with one of them called John, who spoke some English, who had his dog and a placard on his wheelchair. And as best as I could translate the Italian, it said he couldn't work, he was homeless, living on the street, and asked for kindness. Also it said bow, maybe the Italian word for woof woof, from his dog that he got perched on his lap. We also saw a black disabled man lying on the pavement with his twisted feet visible, showing he couldn't walk. Italy did not create the same kind of welfare state as Britain did post-war. I tweeted after this that maybe this was what was lying in wait for us in the UK with welfare reform. Very quickly someone posted a news item that a blind man in Scotland had been forced to beg after his benefits were cut. So it's not a fear for the future, this is already a present reality. And I want to make something clear, this is all my perspective, although this is backed up, I would say, by an enormous body of evidence, that none of what we'll be talking about today is an accident. It is part of a political philosophy. It's a plan. This government and its coalition predecessor believe in a neoliberal value system. They may not be trying deliberately to disabled people and other groups facing oppression. I don't actually think that's part of their thoughts, or something they are familiar with, the idea of. It's just that this is the effect of philosophies such as that. It's based on clearly set out, actually candidly expressed views on the belief that the state is essentially a bad thing, that there should be a smaller state so that people pay less tax. That usually tends to mean that people with more won't pay their fair share. It especially means, and that's what we've been saying for at least 6 years, cutting the supportive state, cutting public spending, reducing regulation, so that there's much more of a free-for-all for those who are more powerful and important. It places a big value on the private sector. It tends to blame the individual if things go wrong for them, so it's a matter of sink or swim. It says that for a few who it believes can't cope, it does recognise in its mind that there are some it sees as not being able to cope. There should be some kind of intervention, but this tends to result in them being negatively stereotyped, to have access to some kind of so-called safety net conceived of in old-style terms. This is clearly the evidence before our eyes. It's been happening here. It wasn't about the financial crisis or a real way of dealing with so-called austerity. It was about redistributing wealth and resources, less or even minimum taxes for rich organisations and individuals, less support for poorer people who, of course, we know from our experience still pay full tax. I was in Italy for 4 days, in Milan, which is a fashion centre of the world for some people. I never saw one, what's that fancy car they make in Italy? Ferrari. I never saw one Ferrari. Almost every day when I'm in Battersea, I see a Ferrari, an Aston Martin, and so on and so on. We are seeing a major redistribution of wealth. And I wouldn't suggest you have to take my word for it. There is a world of evidence. We've heard some from the spirit level. There is no other explanation that fits the evidence. And it is what these politicians themselves frequently will tell us. They see services increasingly as a source of profit for the market sector rather than a universal framework for social justice. So what I'm suggesting is that if we want to see change, we need to find out more about this philosophy. We need to understand it, be explicit about it, and find ways that we can challenge it. It isn't an accident. So long as it's the basis, as it is now, for policy and politics, so long as policymakers are allowed to suggest it's okay, and for their media allies to keep spreading that word, we have a fundamentally worsening problem. as disabled people and other groups facing disadvantage. We have a different story to tell. We have to work out that story much better. We know that these policies have damaging effects which have different, if nonetheless equally destructive consequences for different groups. So discrimination around equality issues is exacerbated. Black and minority ethnic communities fare particularly badly. Mental health service users face oppression because of the difficulty, the failure there seems to be to understand their issues and to frame them instead in narrow medical terms. And people with learning difficulties, especially those without supportive families, are at particular risk of being framed as having negative, challenging behaviour, and we know a particular risk of facing abuse. All the issues of diversity come into the frame, issues facing women, people who are part of the LGBTQ community, older people, younger people, people of different faiths and cultures, all are being increasingly penalised. And I want to offer some more evidence, direct evidence about what's actually happening. So no one can say we are panicking or being extreme in what we say when we say that disabled people are dying, killing themselves, and thinking about killing themselves because of what's happening to them now. So here are some facts and figures. First, from a new research study published late last month by the King's Fund and Nuffield Trust, looking at the state of social care, the policy that disabled people of all ages particularly need to rely on. The report's framed very much in terms of older people, but we know that it applies equally to disabled people of all ages, and those of working age, of course, are being especially hit because of the double whammy of benefits reform. So it offers a situation report, this, framed in terms, its words, of extreme crisis, people and their families, quote, left to fend for themselves, and a priority service scaled back despite years of warnings about major demographic change and rapidly rising need. The report says that the social care system is struggling to meet the needs of older people. I'd suggest it's clearly failing to meet them, causing damage to them, their families, and an age system that has come to be seen as increasingly undermined by the failure of social care to ensure community support. So all the talk we hear, which makes headlines of wasteful and damaging emergency hospital readmissions and so-called bed blocking. The report says that increasing pressure has been placed on service providers through central government grant reductions, or put another way, social care, which is now dominated by the private sector, that's not really working, either to look after those it's meant to look after who need it, or to make the profit that the system now requires. It reports that over the last 5 years, local authority spending on care for older and disabled people has fallen by 11% in real terms. That's from a very poor starting point, and the number of people who receive state-funded help has fallen by more than a quarter, despite the numbers needing it increasing. Public spending, it tells us, on adult social care is set to fall to less than 1% of GDP by 2020, with a predicted funding gap of £2.9 billion by 2019, and many councils struggling to meet basic statutory duties. 1 million people with care needs now receive no formal or informal help, a rise of 10% in a year. Over 40% of money paid to care homes came from people paying for themselves. It says that those who are better able through higher income or cultural capital get the most out of this failing system, but those who are poor and disadvantaged fare especially badly. We also read, again it says these things, home care services face particularly acute workforce shortages and are in a critical condition. The possibility of large-scale provider failure is only a question of when. By having to concentrate on the most acute need, any hope of a preventive approach is being lost. Family carers are increasingly expected to do more, yet this is becoming more and more unsustainable. So we know that the rights and needs of hundreds of thousands, at least, of older and disabled people are being neglected, and their difficulties left to worsen under a hopeless system of social care. The official response to this worsening crisis, under the administration of our new Prime Minister, in response to this report, was, quotes, "This government is committed to ensuring those in old age throughout the country can get affordable and dignified care. That tells us there's very little hope for social care, I would suggest, under this administration. I want to turn now to some other evidence, more direct evidence also, about the failure of support for disabled people. That's research about the effects of the ending of the Independent Living Fund. The first piece of research is from Inclusion London, a disabled people's organisation, published as part of Disabled People Against Cuts Campaign Week of Action, Rights, Not Games, coinciding with the Paralympics. And the second, a peer-reviewed journal article by Tom Porter and Tom Shakespeare, published in Disability and Society, the prestigious journal. The decision to end the Independent Living Fund was based on the view that the new Care Act heralded a transformation in social care, which would now be a personalised service focused on bringing about well-being. So there wouldn't really be a need anymore, a justification for having a separate fund. Both the ILF and mainstream social care, it said, would now be working to the same agenda. It's a logic it's hard to fault in theory, but in reality, the Care Act was never going to bring about these changes, with government requiring local authorities to work exactly as they had done before, with the only real change being in rhetoric. And that's exactly what the reports, the two studies found. They report swinging cuts to the level of support, despite government giving to councils the money the ILF had been providing to those people. The cuts were invariably unexplained and justified with any kind of rationale. Assessments by practitioners who often had no understanding of what was meant by independent living or had any other vision of how life should be for disabled people, practices that had no regard for the views and thoughts of the disabled people themselves. The researchers in both these pieces of work believe that the ILF in some form should be restored, a national service to ensure resourcing of the vision of independent living, to be able to live on as equal terms as non-disabled people as possible, or people with complex needs. Given that they could see no reason to believe that the mainstream care system would ever deliver the personalised service that political and sector leaders had promised, I quite understand that conclusion as the only route to enable this group of people to continue to enjoy a reasonable quality of life. But that cannot be the whole story, because the Independent Living Fund was never the whole story. While the Care Act opened up a path potentially to a better future for social care, the government's guidance to it, I would suggest, is unlikely to result in that path being taken. It ensures the perpetuation of the long-established and depersonalising practices that serve only to enable political and sector leaders to maintain that the amount of money they are putting into the system is sufficient. And that's because it's a system whereby eligible needs are always met. The catch, of course, is that the council can define what is meant by eligible needs. And of course they do this, they have to do this, you could suggest, to suit their declining budgets. Anything not eligible is simply ignored or assumed to be somebody else's responsibility. And that, of course, is a recipe for the failure of social care, the undermining of the NHS, and most importantly, the undermining of disabled people and people with long-term conditions of all ages. So I would argue next we must fight for the recognition and recording of unmet need, which does not now happen, so that the social care funding gap in all its reality will be shown up and pressure for action is increased on it. Again, I want to turn to the Kingston report. It's impossible for me, at least, I don't know about you, to see how social care can be fit for purpose so long as it remains what it now is, the only relic that we have in the UK still of the poor law. It's means tested, it's needs tested, and of course it's inadequately funded. At present, only the poorest get help to pay for services, including help in the home for daily tasks, such as washing and dressing, as well as, if it's available, round-the-clock support in care homes and nursing homes. Yet most people think that, most ordinary people, I think that social care operates on the same principles as the NHS. Adequate funding and real integration, I would argue, are only likely to come when social care services share the same funding base and principles as the NHS. That means a social care and health system jointly based on principles of universalism, not means tested, and being funded by a progressive system of general taxation. Recent governments, including of all three parties, have seen this as an unrealistic and costly option. But if they choose to look at both the financial and the human costs for millions of the present unsustainable system, I would suggest they might be convinced, or we have a lever to try and convince them of the need for such fundamental reform. We must make this one of the principles for our campaigning, otherwise we will all continue to be inclusive of diversity in how we work, while of course recognising our uniquenesses and our differences. If I now want to turn to recent comments very recent comments made by Liz Carr, the long-term disability activist, artist and actress. In a major speech a week or so ago, the star of Silent Witness compared present welfare reform policies with Nazi disability policy. She said, it's about being forgotten and derided and abused and sanctioned and attacked and killed and cut and rationed and reduced and starved and homeless and hungry and fearful and terrified and alone and isolated and abandoned and denied resources and silenced and rendered invisible and made to jump through hoops to prove your worth, devalued, punished, subject to vicious attacks, both by individuals and the state, as that film we saw a moment of also tells us. We must make note of the direction of travel of this government's disability policy, its social policy, not listen to its rhetoric, not imagine there'll be a turning point. Things are getting worse and worse for more and more disabled people as well as other groups. We have to be as canny and informed in developing our responses to it and our objectives for ourselves. We need to develop into an effective second generation disabled people's movement to challenge this new generation of what for me is nothing less than oppression and exclusion. Thank you.
For anybody who'd like to ask if you're okay for that. Is there anybody who'd like to raise a point or make a comment, or we're going to we have a roving mic coming to you, so if you can hear, hopefully. Just the front here, please.
Yes, I agree with everything you said, which doesn't always happen. I thought that was brilliant. One comment I would just like to make, I mean, you mentioned the trailer that we saw from the Ken Loach film. I mean, the tragic thing is that Ken Loach made the film Cathy Come Home, which was in the 1960s. And I think he would quite like to retire. He's in his 80s, but he feels he must go on raising awareness of this sort of thing. And I mean, that's why he's making this film. I, write quite a lot, and I've made the point several times that we are going back to Victorian times, and people say, oh no, surely not. But I think we've become a nation really of, lots of charities springing up all the time, which is fine. I'm glad people want to do it, but it should not be the case. We should not become this kind of nation of where we can all feel very comfortable and worthy helping the less privileged, when the state has just abandoned all responsibility. So I absolutely endorse everything you said. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I must just tell you, I was at a wonderful event yesterday, a small but wonderful event, a launch of a new study by a woman called Mo Stewart, who's a long-term disabled campaigner, a former servicewoman. And speaking at the launch was John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, and also Tanni Gray-Thompson, who's come back from the Paralympics. And what Mo has done in her study is dissect the welfare reform and show its appalling dishonesty, cruelty and corruption. And I'm sad to say this is a programme that's been going on through New Labour onwards. But although we were hearing some terrible things at this event, it was an optimistic and cheering occasion because one had the sense that we may be at a tipping point. Our lives are going through circumstances which I don't think there's been in living memory an equivalent of. But there is more happening. People are becoming more engaged. People are struggling more. And I take as symbolic of that, both the Scottish decision and the closeness of it in relation to seeking independence. The election of a Labour mayor in London, where I think all the vitriolic, terrible, racist rubbish that was spread by the Tory candidate and by the Tory press was dissed by the people who experience the reality of how difficult London is becoming for millions of ordinary people. And even I've managed to convince myself the protest vote for Brexit, its consequences are terrible, but I think it was about people feeling utterly excluded by the modern politics we have. And that has to be built on, and that's why I emphasise alliances and hope. But we will not get anywhere, in my view, if we try the old things. It's not going to come this by people saying, this is wrong, it shouldn't happen. Those of us who are educated and special say that, and we will be a voice for people down there. No, it's got to come as things, for example, have come from the disabled people movement from the bottom up. All the big changes that we've seen in modern times in this country, we have a politics based in the 18th century, but a formal politics. But if you look at, I'm not saying things are sorted, but the challenges that have come from all the new social movements from the last quarter of the 20th century onwards, they're how we are living differently, in less discriminatory and judgmental and cruel ways with our differences as people, as women, as members of the LGBT community, as people committed to black and civil rights, and so on and so on. That's how we will change things. And we should not fall into the trap. I mean, I'm shocked when we talk about charity to hear yesterday at that meeting from somebody as a mental health service user that Mind's resources run to £230+ million. But Mind is in bed, absolutely, with this government. That's appalling. It should be the ally of mental health service users, not being involved in formulating negative, damaging government policies. I had to go to the dentist yesterday morning, so I had a very rare chance to read the posh magazines like The Tatler. And admittedly, they were a few months old. I don't get to see them normally, or Hello, but you realise when you read them, none of this matters to them. None of this is happening to them. There is a parallel world which they are enjoying and luxuriating in, just as there was in the 1920s, through the most appalling situations which are being echoed now. So I think you're right. I think we have to challenge, we have to have our own ideas, and it's great that we have days like today when we can work them out together. Friends and people with shared experience.
Is there another comment? Anybody else got a question? I've got a question.
Thank you. Just have a... Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned charity, and I'm going to ask a question that probably before today I might have thought I would never ask, because the charity model is not one that I've ever felt offered any solutions that we wanted. But we might be in a situation where desperate times call for desperate measures. So anyway, to get to the point, my question is, do you think that any part of the solution can involve what we might call enlightened philanthropism, if indeed you accept that such a thing could possibly exist? Enlightened philanthropism. I'm thinking about, the Bill Gates Foundation, that type of model, Warren Buffett. We don't actually have anything like that in this country. Our super rich people seem very happy to keep all their money for themselves. I'm not saying this is the answer, I'm just asking the question, because it's kind of like something that's the elephant in the room we never talk about. Maybe we should.
Well, one of the things that I've learned doing the work I've done is that very many decent people, and we know actually that charity is essentially a regressive form of taxation. As George Orwell said, it's people who've got nothing who give money to people who've got nothing. It isn't generally rich people. I mean, Warren Buffett, who stole billions from societies, and the Gates Foundation that charged enormous amounts of money We might argue it would be better for them and many others just to pay their taxes than to give to what they want to give in the way they want to give to get wonderful reputations as philanthropists. But what I notice in all the work I've ever done, there are many people, decent people, who want to give to charity. I have yet to meet anybody who wants to receive charity. People don't want to get charity. That you can, you know, when you read case papers from Victorian times onwards, people try not to. It's desperation that means that people have to turn to charity. And just listening to, remembering what my partner Susie, who spent 26 years working as a palliative care social worker, talking about some of the people who are dying that she works with or have faced bereavement, going to food banks and being told, for example, you can only claim how many times, or no, using the hospice address doesn't qualify, and having to try and work out different addresses. I actually think that some of the food banks, and I'm not saying all, which are becoming incorporated in the welfare policy of this government in some very adverse ways, they are in other unnecessary and damaging ways replicating the worst of Victorian charity. We had a brilliant system created at the most terrible times of adversity, post-Second World War, of trying to equalise taxation and look after each other. The state was patronising then, it was top-down, it didn't address diversity. That's the lessons I've learned. But we've begun over the years to challenge that. I've never encountered a better arrangement than taxation, which is fair and redistributive. Of course, very rich and powerful people and institutions do not want that, and that's why we've moved so heavily away from it. I would love to see a world where we had not what's called charity, but a kind of more redefined third sector we do actually have, where there can be much more equal relationships between people who benefit from support and services and work with such organisations and people who run them. But my organisation, Shaping Ours, we've always had to steer clear of becoming a registered charity because it would mean that the people who are involved, all of us are service users, would no longer be able to be paid for the work that we do. Because it's such an antiquated model of benefactors and be done tos. So I don't personally fancy the American philanthropy model, and I certainly don't fancy unequal relationships, which that's symbolic of.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much.